This episode is brought to you by Sacred Rights, which provides support, resources, and networks for religion scholars committed to translating their research to a broader audience. You can find more information about their work at sacred-rights.org. Thank you so much for joining me. This is Greg Soden. I am delighted to welcome Dr. Susannah Crockford to the podcast for this episode. Susannah Crockford is a lecturer in anthropology at the University of Exeter and received a PhD from the London School of Economics and Political Science. Dr. Crockford is an anthropologist of New Age spirituality, ecology, and conspiracy theories, and is the author of Ripples of the Universe, Spirituality in Sedona, Arizona, from the University of Chicago Press in 2021. On this episode, we are discussing the brand new book, A Perturbed System, Religion and Climate Change from the End of a World, out in July of 2026 from the University of Chicago Press. In A Perturbed System, Crockford argues that we must understand the climate emergency as a spiritual crisis, a result of Christian colonialism that we, religious or not, still struggle to describe without religious language. We discuss the theological motifs that drove extraction, including ideas of prophecy, mediation, sacrifice, original sin, cult, Messiah, and apocalypse. Please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Susannah Crockford. Dr. Susannah Crockford, welcome back to the show. Thank you so much for being here today.
Hi, Greg. It's wonderful to be back. Very
I
happy.
am delighted that you're here. You were last here with me, and we chatted in 2021. And I can't believe 5 years have passed, but it's wonderful to get together again. I love having return guests. Can you just spend a moment and introduce yourself a little bit to the listeners out there and remind them of who you are and what you do? Just a little potted bio.
Absolutely. So I'm an anthropologist and I study spirituality, as in sort of metaphysical or New Age spirituality. And along with that, I tend to talk a lot about conspiracy theories because those two things have a lot of overlap. So when I was last here, we talked about January 6th and the Capitol siege and that very prominent figure of the man with the tattoos and the horns called Jake Angeli. Because he calls himself a shaman, right? And a starseed, but he's also into QAnon, right? So he's kind of typifies that overlap that I study a lot of conspiracy theories on the one hand and spirituality on the other hand. So a lot of my work focuses on that. However, as an anthropologist, I also study other things. So I also study environments and how people understand different environments that they live in, and medicine and healthcare, and how people have different ideas in different places about what constitutes good health, like what builds immunity, where does health come from, right? Those are the sorts of questions that I'm interested in. And the questions about health and wellness obviously overlap a bit with spirituality because a lot of spirituality also gets packaged in with things like wellness and this subjective feeling of kind of improving your health to an optimizable level, which for some people is a spiritual imperative as well as a healthcare principle. So I do field work mostly in Arizona, but I've been several other places as well, both in the US and Northern Europe.
Excellent. Well, I think that last time we spoke, I think that you were transitioning back to the UK from spending some time in Arizona. Where does the world find you today?
Yes, so I now live in southwest England in Devon, which if you imagine England as having this boot at the bottom that sticks out, I'm right down there on the boot. So I was in Arizona before. I was in Arizona 2020 to 2021, and then I moved back to the UK at the end of 2021. Great decision, I just want to say.
Yeah, yeah, good timing. I really am a big fan of that region of England as well.
Oh,
I
it's
yeah, I
beautiful.
love Devon. I love Cornwall. It's fantastic down there.
Lovely.
I remember I went surfing in St. Ives one time, and it was absolutely delightful.
Yeah,
You
great
picked,
surfing.
yeah,
Yeah,
you
people
picked
wouldn't
a good
think
spot.
it in
Yeah.
England, but yeah, great surfing.
Yeah, you definitely need a thick wetsuit, but it's very fun. Okay, so last time you were here, we chatted a lot about Ripples in the Universe, one of your
Mm.
books. You have a new book coming out in 2026 called A Perturbed System, Religion and Climate Change from the end of a world.
Yes.
I would love to know about how this project began. Take me back to the beginning of when this kind of started to percolate in your mind.
This project began in 2018. I got the opportunity to work on a large funded project. It was funded by the European Research Council. And so I went to live in Belgium, in Ghent, which is a city in the Dutch-speaking region of Belgium. And the whole project was about the Anthropocene, and it was some of the people were working on literature. I was working on sort of oral storytelling, talking to people about how they were experiencing climates and environments in this period called the Anthropocene, which is this idea that we're in a geological era where humans are affecting, changing purposefully Earth systems. And there's lots of different ways that you can track that change. So it's all about what's happening in climates and environments now in these periods of radical change where we're seeing things like anthropogenic climate change, but also biodiversity loss, also plastic pollution on the lands and the ocean. So it's not just climate change, at least in the whole project, it's lots of different ways of looking at ecosystem change. But I decided to look specifically at climate change. The reason why I started with these questions actually goes back a little further to 2017 when I was working on a project on millenarianism, right? So millenarianism's really, it was really fun, let's say a few years ago. Millenarianism is ideas about the end of the world, especially religious groups that think the world is going to end and they know when it's going to happen. So I got really into millenarianism, especially in like my early studies as a PhD student, because I was like, oh, this is fascinating, right? Stuff like the Millerites who are like getting up on their roofs. They're like, we know it. We know the date. We're going to sit up on our roof and wait. And then it doesn't happen. And I
Hmm.
was so fascinated by this because I was like, how does that feel, right? What's that like? So I was doing this project in 2017 where I wrote profiles on different types of millenarians. And I wrote about environmental millenarians, which is people who think that climate change, but the associated ecological crises that I just described, are going to end the world. And I was like, oh no, well, this is much less fun because this could really be true. Like, this could really happen. This isn't like the Millerites waiting on their roof, right? This is something that climate scientists say is very likely that we're going to face these massive, wide-scale changes that could severely limit our ability to live on Earth. So the more I started researching, I think my one of my coping strategies is research. I just got really into researching it. And then I had this opportunity to join this project and I was like, I'm going to write about climate change and I'm going to write about social responses to climate change. Because there's a lot, obviously, of study of climate science and how the Earth systems are changing. Obviously, there's work in political science on climate policy. But what I find there's a lot less of is how are people, just like ordinary people around the world, dealing with climate change? How are they responding to it? Do they think about it? Do they talk about it? Do they deny it? So these were the sorts of things that I wanted to study and to research, like how are people coping now? How are they responding to it? And this really does link into the millenarianism because a not insignificant number of people do think that it could be, the end of the world for real this time because of what's happening to the planet. At least for
Hmm.
humans, right? There's all these other questions you can sort of ask, and then we can kind of get on to what the book ended up being about, which was really about, as the title indicates, it's about how worlds end and what happens and who does it end for.
Yeah, so what could like central question or questions do you think that this book specifically like seeks to address for the readers?
This book specifically addresses questions about climate discourse. So that means how do we talk about climate change? So I'm not a climate scientist. I'm not looking at science. What I'm looking at is more like how do people talk about climate science? And so I did talk to scientists, so that is in there, but it's about the things that people say, but also the things they cannot say. And it's about the questions that people can ask and still be taken seriously. So there's this concept of the Overton window, which you might be familiar with, right? The
Hmm.
Overton window is this idea, it's basically a way of thinking about discourse, right? That there's this range of topics that you can talk about and still be taken as a serious person who's not mad or just, talking about something completely different in a specific area, right? And that's what social scientists call discourse, basically. So I'm talking about climate discourse and how religion frames, right? If you think about the edges of this window, religion frames climate discourse. That even though we think of climate change as something scientific, which it is, the way people talk about it, even scientists themselves, has these religious frameworks built into it because of the cultural inheritances of Christianity in Europe and North America. So I should specify that all of my research for this was done in the US and Northern Europe. So I'm talking about Anglophone contexts in Europe and America. So the religious inheritances that were very important in those areas was Christianity, mainly, broadly
Hmm.
speaking. So the argument is that in order to understand the way people talk about climate change and the things they also feel like they cannot say and the things that feel like cannot be taken seriously, you have to understand this long history of Christianity and how it informs the way people see the world.
Excellent. So, I would love to know like the story of how the research begins to unfold, like where you go, who you wind up talking to, what places you see. Tell me a little bit about like the physical context of where you go, some of the people you begin to talk to. How does this begin to take shape?
For this book, that's a really interesting story because it's multi-sited. So you mentioned my previous book, which is called Ripples of the Universe. That's just about Sedona. I went to one town,
Hmm.
17,000 people in northern Arizona, and I lived there for 2 years. Right? And that's a very classical anthropological thing to do. But for this research, I went to lots of different places. So I did field work in northern Arizona again, but also in Louisiana along the coast, Missouri, central Missouri. Is that where you're from?
I'm from there.
You're
That's where
from.
I'm.
So
Yes,
I
I
was in
am.
like Vienna, Missouri, like these tiny
Amazing.
little towns.
How far away from Columbia were you in
So
Missouri?
I was further south than Columbia, but I've given a talk at Columbia, Missouri. I've been there. They have a
That's
university there. So I've
Yeah,
been to Missouri quite a few
that's my
times now.
place. That's where I'm from. Yep. Amazing.
Yeah, so it was those three sites in the US, and then in Northern Europe, I was in Southwest England, where I now live, Sweden, and Belgium, which is
Mm.
where I was living, because that's where I was the university I was working at. Um, so it's all these different places, and I talked to different groups of people. I started off with three main groups of people that I aimed to talk to. One was climate scientists, one was climate activists, and the other was climate skeptics or deniers. I this may not be shocking, but I found most of the climate deniers in the US.
Well, yeah, of course. That's not surprising at all.
So when I went to see climate scientists, I went to like universities in Belgium and the UK, and the activists I spoke to were in the UK and Sweden, but then the deniers were all in the US. But I managed to find other people along the way. For example, oil and gas engineers, which you may not technically call climate scientists, but like so people who work in the oil and gas industry, people who um are involved in climate change in sort of various other sort of lateral ways, like through policy work and legal work, and also just like ordinary people without any specific position. I would just start talking to people about climate change. It was really interesting because like some people, I'd say quite a number of people, don't have a lot to say about it actually. And this
Hmm.
isn't just I mean, yes, in the US, like especially in the South, and you start talking to people about climate change, they look at you like you got a second head. Um, Like you're talking some made up Democrat nonsense there.
Oh yeah. Well, and you mentioned the coastal Louisiana. I mean, there's a massive oil and gas industry all along that coast. I have family members that worked in it down in Louisiana specifically, so I know quite a lot about that region.
Yeah, so they're quite, even though the oil and gas industry in Louisiana isn't as important as it once was economically, like a lot of the jobs have gone, it still has this massive level of cultural support.
It's kind of like
And
the oil coal in West Virginia, like a
yes,
lot of that has gone
yes.
away, but it's still like the resonance of the entire
Yes.
region, and they
And you
they look
see it in
back
the
on it.
landscape, right? You see like kind of abandoned oil drum, like not just drums, but like huge tankers where they would store it on the land, and people would talk about how their land had got disturbed by drilling pipelines and stuff. But if you sort of questioned the importance of this industry, they'd be like, well, it's jobs and people need jobs. Right, and
Hmm.
that's it. And this is how you get jobs, and you know what you're gonna do. It was a real you can't stop progress attitude, right? Oil and gas meant jobs, economy, wealth. And if you're against that, then you're basically some kind of like you were outside of that window, right? You were talking crazy kind of thing.
Yeah.
But
As
it's
I,
interesting.
oh, sorry,
Sorry.
go ahead.
I was going to say, interestingly, what I found was that doesn't mean they didn't care about environmental problems. Like, for example, in coastal Louisiana, they're very aware of the problems they have there with erosion, and how they're losing about a football fields of land every hour in
Mm.
coastal Louisiana. So it's a big problem and they know about it, but they don't necessarily connect that problem to the problem of climate change or the oil and gas industry.
Yes. So as I'm looking through the book, I love the way that it's organized. You have it organized around themes that are very religious in nature because of the way you tie the discussions around climate change to religion. Like we have prophecy, mediation, sacrifice, original sin, cult, Messiah, apocalypse. Tell me a little bit about the development and emergence of these themes as you're working on the book. How does this structure take shape for you as the writer?
This structure really arose from the material itself. When I started writing this book, I didn't think it was going to be about religion. Like when I started doing my research, I just thought I was going to talk to people about climate change, and I didn't think it was going to be about religion at all. And I think I originally had it structured by like emotion or like affects, right?
Mm,
Fear, panic, right? And then as I started thinking about it more, I was like, oh no, there's something much deeper than that going on here. And the one that first suggested it to me was, I think it was Original Sin, because that chapter's all about economics and growth. And the way, as we were just saying, the way people talk about the fossil fuel industry, right, is that it is necessary and inevitable, right? People need power, economy needs to grow, therefore we must have fossil fuels. And therefore, what happens because of those fossil fuels, the emissions that are the major contribution to climate change, it's like over 92% of carbon emissions in the atmosphere come from the burning of fossil fuels. So there is one main cause of this problem, right? Regardless of any other causes you may hear about. It is mainly the burning of oil, coal, and gas. But this is seen as inevitable because humans need to grow, right? And so there's all of these things that are bundled in there, right? That if humans are going to live, they have to keep having more. And in order to have more, we have to have economic growth. And in order to have economic growth, we have to have fossil fuels powering it. And there's all these assumptions which I discovered people just didn't unpack. And at the underneath all of these assumptions was this one big assumption about human nature, that if humans have a resource, they will use it and they will use it up until it's all gone. And that is the way that we inevitably are. And the more I started thinking about it, the more I was like, well, that's actually just like that's what original sin is, right? That we are
mm,
born sinful and we will inevitably sin. And obviously in Christian theology, especially Catholic theology, the idea is therefore we have to, have Jesus in our lives in order to save us from our inherently fallen nature. But I think what I really discovered was that a lot of the thinking is similar, but instead of having God there or Jesus, they had this idea of the economy and growth, that this was inevitable and we had to do it this way because that's just the way humans are, right? So that our human nature, right, is to grow and multiply, and therefore, in a way, climate change becomes the outcome of this, and our original sin. And then I started noticing all these other motifs. So, I mean, apocalypse was another really obvious one, because that chapter is all about what I, in my notes, would call climate doomism. I didn't use that so much in the book, but if you start listening to people talk about climate change at all for any length of time, you will hear people who are like, "Well, we're doomed. Temperature's going to rise by like who knows, 18 degrees. We're going to be living on the surface of Venus, except we won't obviously be alive because no one can live under those conditions." And the interesting thing about these doomers is that they are most often people who absolutely accept the science of climate change, but they take it to the extreme that they sort of end up in the same place as people who outright deny it, which is just this absolute paralysis, right? There's nothing you can do. And so the idea of apocalypse really suggested itself to me when I was writing the chapter about climate doomers, who, again, I try not to use that word. I try not to say deniers either, but Yeah, and so then I went through each chapter and I was like, oh no, I can see I can see actually how there's all these religious I think I called them theological motifs in the end, but they're these religious themes and they're all from Christian theology. And the more I started to think about it, the more I was like, well, yes, because we have these cultures in Europe and America which are absolutely emerged through Christianity. Like there's bound up with our political systems or our social norms. And you get to like the 18th, 19th century and it starts to separate from public life, right? At least officially. At least in
Mm.
Europe, it's different in America.
Oh yeah. I'm looking at, and I'm just putting my own observations on this, but whenever I'm looking at this book, like something that I love is the chapter 5 about cult, and the a deep need to stay blind is the
Yeah.
subtitle of that chapter. And I just love that subtitle, A Deep Need to Stay Blind. Tell me a little bit about that chapter because it just like
Yeah.
I think it resonates so much with me, and I think that it'll resonate with a lot of listeners as well.
It's about denial. It's about climate denial. And I have to say that I can't take credit for that subtitle. I heard that during the course of my research from an artist, a Dutch artist,
Mm,
who had done this installation about colonialism. The Dutch are very bad at sort of admitting their own colonial history, and they tend to think that they're very sort of above it and innocent of all of the horrific colonial crimes that are quite obvious in things like the history of the British Empire and
hmm
the French. And she was the one who said that, that in Dutch society there's this deep need to stay blind. And I was
mm,
like, oh, that's like with climate change too. It's like it's like we're attached to the things that we don't want to see. So I really delved into this concept of denial. Like what does it mean to be in denial? Because it's very easy. And I start off the chapter with talking about, some of the obvious culprits, these guys, and they are usually guys, and they're usually older white men, and they're usually pretty prosperous in their own lives, and they think that they're quite well educated. And they come up with all of these scientific sounding reasons why climate change is false and climate scientists are all corrupt and you shouldn't listen to them. And nearly all of their arguments come almost directly from fossil fuel company disinformation and propaganda, right? And
hmm
there's a purposeful uh plan. Yeah, it's basically a plan by fossil fuels companies to do this so that they can keep making money even though they're destroying the planet, which is it should be considered a massive crime. So I start with the obvious guys who talk about climate denial, and then I just keep going deeper into it. But like, okay, so they're the ones who you can point at and go, well, they're the problem, but they're numerically very small, and they're usually older, and these people aren't, to put it bluntly, going to be around forever. What are the rest of us doing? Actually, we also are not doing very much, even though we accept the science of climate change. We're still traveling, we're still living the same way, especially in, cultures in Northern Europe and America where we have the resources to do these things.
hmm
And then it comes back to that link with colonialism that I mentioned with the artist and sort of the deep structures of white supremacy in these countries where we are so we just don't even think about it. We don't think about where our wealth comes from. We don't think about where our privilege comes from. We don't want to. And in Europe, I would say probably they were a bit worse at this than in America because, we like to look at America and go, "Oh, what a mess. You're so racist."
Yeah.
But we don't look at ourselves and the racism in our own country and how much we've profited historically off slavery and colonialism. And the same history of slavery and colonialism is the same one that created things like the plantation system, which causes massive ecosystem change, which is then also at the root of the climate crisis, right? It's the very same locations that had the plantation, places like Louisiana, that then became the places where you found oil and gas.
Mm.
Right, so it's these same interlocking histories. And so the deep need to stay blind is really this deep need to just not look at any of that, because then you might have to do something about it, right? Because we tend to use denial in this way, like, oh, you can't deal with that. But it's like, actually, no, like if you're talking about the psychological concept of denial, like an alcoholic, they know they're drinking. But if they accepted that what they were doing by drinking was killing them, then well, obviously they would have to stop, right? And that's where the denial comes in. It's not that you don't know what you're doing. Like we know that climate change is happening. It's that if we took it seriously, we would then have to take the next step and stop doing it. And that's where you have this deep need to stay blind, right? To refuse to see the elephant in the room. Because
Mm.
if you did, then you'd have to actually act.
Yeah, well,
And we don't want to do that.
and if anybody thinks about their own lives, like if there's any bad habits that people have out there and they do them and they're like, "Oh, I'm going to stop doing that." Well, change is very difficult whenever you do something that brings you comfort, whether you're going through something challenging. And if it brings you comfort in an onslaught of craziness in a world, like you're gonna keep leaning on that crutch. And so there's so many ways that you could think about that with down to every single individual person's life with regards to any vices or anything like that they may have.
Absolutely. And this is where my own insight into this came from. Because throughout this whole period that I was doing the research for this book and then trying to, well, not so much trying to write it, but especially when I was doing the research, I was in a relationship which I definitely didn't want to look at. Let's put it that way. Because if I looked at it, I would have to do something about it. And it was the
Mm,
consequences from that I wasn't ready to deal with yet. And that's also in this book as well. So I do this thing in this book where I try to make it clear what I was doing at the same time as I was doing my research. Like, yes, it's very academic and I talk about my interlocutors, but also at the very beginning, at the very end, I also talk about like what I was doing and what I went through at the same time. So there's this parallel that I draw between worlds ending, right? That worlds end all the time is what I say. But then I also talk about how my own world ended through the process of writing, doing this research and writing this book. But then it begins again, right? That's where the apocalyptic motif becomes hopeful, right? Because one world ends, but then a new one begins, right? That's what the second coming was meant to be about, right?
yeah.
So like just like you said, it's got this sense of like it can happen on your own personal life, but it's sort of like a correspondence almost. So what I'm trying to do is throughout the book is I'm trying to get people to not just understand climate change, yes, and what's going on socially, but also like how the personal journeys that we go through reproduce these same patterns. And actually, that's not irrelevant or trivial. And that can be a resource for getting through this period that we're going through
Mm.
collectively in terms of climate change.
What is a story or a memory that you have, like when you're traveling for the book, that is like one of your most standout favorite, like experiences that you had while researching?
It's probably Devon. There's this really, to me, funny coincidence where I went and did fieldwork at this place called Schumacher College, which is in this old aristocratic estate called Dartington Hall, which is quite near Totnes in South Devon. And I went there and I hung out with climate activists for a week, and that became part of the final chapter, which is about apocalypse. Because if you hang out with, I mean, one of the other participants called them doom hippies. They really are like right in there of like, oh, society is about to collapse. And we were
Yeah.
discussing this article that had been written by this professor called Jem Bendell from the UK, who literally he wrote an academic article which was society will inevitably collapse. What are you going to do about it, right? Because of climate change. And
Yeah.
this article became quite famous for an academic article, right? But it was like written up in the New York Times and Vice, and like people were like questioning their lives and quitting their jobs because they read this article and they were like, I can't continue in the same way because of what I have read here. The article's not even very good, but it's very alarming, and it's written by someone who like has this like position as a credentialed insider. But to me, looking at all this, like this is classic millenarianism, right? Someone's told me the truth of the imminence of the end, so now I must change my ways, repent, and do something different. So I was in Devon. I was talking to these people who were like, talking about the end of the world, fun stuff. But I was having this great time because I was like, wow, Devon's beautiful. And I remember talking to some people who I actually got on with really well there. And I was like, I could totally like just see myself just living in Devon. It would be amazing. I would love it. And they were like, oh, you should do it. And I was like, oh no, I can't do that. That's not possible for me right now, just because of, everything that, the way my life is right now. It wasn't going to happen for me to go back to the UK. This is 2019. 2 years later, just over 2 years later, I got offered a job in Exeter in Devon, and then I really did move back there. And so it was just this like wonderful part where I was like, oh, I went there, and I was like, I really wanted to live there, and I didn't think it was possible. But then through the whole process of this whole crazy journey I went through while researching this book and then writing this book, I actually did end up back there. It felt very it was like this very sort of neat narrative circle for me. And then I came back to Devon.
I love that too. That's so fun too. It was all meant to be. So the end of the book, you've got something, a little section called "A Species Experiencing Its Own Extinction." And is there any like concluding thoughts that you would like to leave listeners with to kind of hook them in? Because people are looking around and they're seeing things in their own way and they're noticing things and they're making connections. People are realizing that some of the ways that we live will go extinct. So, what would you say to leave listeners with, like as a hook to kind of pull and then be like, "Hey, check this book out."
I would say the end of this book is very hopeful. So it may come across as it's quite a gloomy subject, and a lot of people don't want to talk about it, which is again one of the premises that I started with the whole book. But by the end, what you get is you get this understanding of this journey, not just that we are all going through in terms of climate change, but I also show you the journey that I went through personally in doing this research, where what I learned was that hope isn't about optimism, right? You can read all of the papers and hear all the scientists and you'll be very depressed. I practically guarantee that because it happened to me, right? And I spent many years being like just absolutely depressed about climate change and thinking that there was no hope, it was never going to change, things were never going to get any better. And one thing I realized was that you can't live in that despair and that we still need to live now. All of those terrible things, some things are happening which are very bad. Some things will continue to happen, things like sea level rise, and that will happen regardless of what we do or not. But the more quickly we act, the less of those negative impacts we're going to face. So the sooner we act, the more we do, the fewer impacts we will face. So if you live in despair, you're not going to start doing things, right? Despair leads to paralysis. Hope isn't optimism, right? Optimism is the sense like, yes, I think things are going to go all right. No. Hope is a resource, right? And you have hope because you need it, not because you think it's going to turn out okay. One of my favorite interlocutors would talk about planting a tree that you have no possible way of sitting underneath, but you plant the tree anyway,
Hmm.
right? And that I hope is the takeaway for this book. It will help you get to the space you need to be to plant that tree for your future generations to sit underneath.
Amazing. Well, the book is, just to remind everybody, A Perturbed System, Religion and Climate Change from the End of the World, coming out from the University of Chicago Press. And I believe it's a Class 200 book, correct?
Correct.
Tell me what is the, just to tell people out there, this is an amazing series of books in religion from the University of Chicago. Some of my favorite books in the last 5 years I've read have been Class 200 books. What is the goal of this series for listeners who may not know about this amazing series from University of Chicago?
Class 200 series is about innovative works in religion. So it's about bringing not only the most cutting edge research in religious studies right now, it's also about those that play with form. So the idea that when you're writing theory, your form, like the form that your book takes, is also part of that theory. So you get these really inventive, fun, interesting, kind of insightful books in this series. And I would absolutely recommend going reading them all. And not just because I have two books in that series.
Yeah, I know you do. Yeah, Ripples in the Universe is one too.
Yes.
Yeah, and there's another one I read by Maya Katrosis, which was really
Yes.
fascinating. Oh
The Lives of
man.
Objects. I read that too, and I'm definitely not an early Christianity scholar, which is what the book is about, but I read it and I loved it. And there's so many books in that series like that, where it's like, even if this isn't your specific field, they're appealing enough and they're interesting enough and they're just fascinating that you want to read them anyway.
Mm. Have you ever dabbled with doing audiobooks at all with your books? Have you ever thought about that?
No, I made a podcast once.
Ooh, tell us about your podcast. Where
So
is
do
it
you
still
know?
online? Where can we find it?
Yes, yes. Do you know Brad Onishi? He makes Straight White American Jesus. So
Yes.
that's a podcast that's ongoing, which absolutely people should go check out. He did a series of mini series under his company, which is called Access Mundi Media. And one of those mini series is made by me. It's called Misinformation. Two words, right?
Mm.
And
Yes.
it's about conspiracy theories, disinformation, and misinformation. And the first series came out in 2024. And if you go to the Straight White American Jesus site, you'll be able to find that one. And there's loads more. Like there's one that I think it's Sarah Mosler did about purity culture. It's got some really fascinating stuff on there.
I did listen to Sarah Mosler's series actually, so yes, this is all coming back to me now. Is the I know I've read some work by you recently. I believe it was in Religion Dispatches about RFK Jr. and his campaign against seed oils. Is that part of your did that stem out of the podcast where you're looking at misinformation in society?
It's part of that same trajectory in my work of looking at conspiracy theories, misinformation, disinformation, but also spirituality and wellness. So RFK Jr. is a figure that I have, for various reasons, had to read about for some time now. So he ran this group, Children's Health Defense Fund. He was an environmental lawyer, obviously part of the Kennedy family, just a bit everyone knows about him. Um, and he ran for the Democratic nomination, didn't get it, and then moved over to the Trump side. And a lot of people thought that was really weird, but actually it sort of makes sense because in wellness and spirituality, there is this very strong right-wing strain that they don't mind being in the same car as MAGA because they're going in a similar direction. And RFK Jr. really represents that crossover, which is all about thinking about health as something that is created through nature,
Hmm.
right? So not through the products of pharmaceutical companies, right? Like vaccines. Those are artificial and those are poisonous, right? And that's how you make yourself sick. So there's this whole idea that, the drugs that we take, that the doctors prescribe us, that the pharmaceutical companies make, who are all bad because they're big pharma. And I'm not saying they're good, but this is the way they think in this sort of area, those are all making us sick, right? And the way to be healthy is to get rid of all of those and be as natural as possible in your diet, as well as like not taking medications, not getting vaccinated. And a lot of this came to a lot more attention during the pandemic, obviously, because there was the issue with vaccines. But then obviously RFK Jr. got made the head of Health and Human Services. And from a public health perspective, that is an absolute disaster, right?
Mm.
Is an absolute disaster. And seed oils is part of this, right? So the idea is that oils that are made from different types of seed, like rapeseed, whatever, are bad for you. And the reason why I came up with I wanted to write this article because I saw something, I think it was in the Associated Press, and it was like these nutritionists who had been interviewed by a journalist, and they were like, we're so confused as to why anyone would say this because there is nothing specific about, the health problems of seed oils. Like, why are they saying this? I was like, aha, because they're not making nutritional arguments. They're making ideological arguments based in the
Mm.
premises of wellness and spirituality, which is that seed oils are not natural, right?
Mm.
So you should be using natural beef tallow, right? That was what I think Kennedy came out and said that, right? And there was some company, I think it was it Shake? No. Was it Shake Shack or Steak and Shake? I can't
Steak and
remember.
Shake. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Steak and Shake, there we go. That had switched to tallow, to
Yeah.
frying in beef tallow, which obviously bad if you're a vegetarian. It's also got higher in saturated fat. So like from a nutritional perspective, it's not great. But also just like there's nothing wrong with seed oils, right? Nutritionally, right? They're not even like grouped that well as a class, right? Because it sort of depends on which oil and all this kind of thing. But it just kind of got taken up really quickly, and I would hear it all the time from people like, "Oh yeah, I hear seed oil is bad." And I'm like, "No, no, no, there's nothing wrong with seed oil. It's just because it's seen as artificial, right? And not natural." But then there's also this deeper level to it that I discovered as I started researching to it. Like beyond this kind of principle of like, nature is good, nature is beneficial to human health, which it's not, right? Nature doesn't care about your health. Like arsenic occurs naturally, and if you drink it from the water, even if it's from directly from a stream, like you will get sick, right? So this whole idea that nature is beneficial for human health is just absolutely ideological. It's not sound.
That's such a good point too.
Well, you hear it all the time as well. It's like natural flavors, right? This is natural. I'm like, viruses are natural, my friend. They can still kill me,
Yeah.
right? Um, But yeah, so underneath this whole like, artificial, human-made, bad, nature good sort of division, there was actually even more underneath it because the whole linkage between seed oils being bad for you actually came from this idea that seed oils have more estrogen in them. And this kind of led to this really like dark sort of alt-right rabbit hole that we're getting too much estrogen and it's basic like from our food.
Hmm.
But also from like there's also other like narratives about how there's estrogen in the water because all of these women taking estrogen for birth control. I mean, they're peeing into the wastewater. And then if you recycle wastewater, what you're doing is recycling estrogen. Like none of this is very valid. Like because all of those products are taken out when you recycle wastewater. It's not done for potable water anyway. Um, but there's this idea that because of all this like contamination in the water supply and in the food supply, specifically of estrogen, that men are becoming more effeminate and the food and the water is to blame. Um, and I mean that's so problematic on so many levels, right? Number one, it's not bad if men are, becoming more. Also, estrogen doesn't work that way, right? So it's very much like it's based on this idea that being female in any way is bad and
Hmm.
the way that you become more female is it's because you have more estrogen. So it's this very kind of gender essentialist and normative idea about like what makes gender and then also obviously the hierarchical ordering that obviously it would be negative if men had more estrogen, right? So all of this is kind of assumptions that underlie this kind of strange claim that seed oils are bad for you.
Yeah. Yeah, like your work is so fun and interesting to me because you have so many interests and I kind of just envision you being like seeing something like, "Oh my gosh." And then be like putting all these pieces together and then something else happens and it feels like right now you specifically would just be on overload because of your research areas that you work in, that you would just be bombarded every single day with too many things than you could ever like that you would want to do, but you just can't quite get there because there's so many other things that happen all at the same time.
Yes, like one of the, I mean, it's sort of good for my research, bad for the world, is that the things that I study became very relevant and mainstream when they used to be quite fringe and weird and extreme.
That has to be so strange to watch.
It's so weird because when I started my research, everyone was like, "Why are you studying that? You're never gonna get a job. No one cares." And I was like, "I'm gonna do this because I'm interested." And um, and I just researched it anyway, and then suddenly it became really mainstream where all of these conspiracy narratives and kind of like weird esoteric stuff got taken up by like major political parties. And yeah, especially with all of the RFK Jr. stuff, I'm just like, oh no, these are just the worst guys who I've been like reading about for years, who are like these sort of anti-vax doctors who make all these false claims. And now suddenly they're on committees in the CDC deciding the vaccine schedule for like all of America. And I'm like, this is just the worst thing that could ever happen in terms of public health. Yeah,
Well,
it's kind of overwhelming and distressing. I just finished actually the draft of the whole book about conspiracy theories because I couldn't help myself. I was like, I gotta write all this down. It's about how conspiracy theories are now federal government policy.
when is this third book coming?
Yes. Yes. It's almost like there's too much for me to write about right now, and I can't stop. I'm just like, no, I have to tell everyone just exactly where all this weird stuff came from and what it means and why it's bad.
Well, promise me you'll come on and talk about the new conspiracy theory third book as well, okay?
I will, absolutely, I will. I mean, it's still with the publisher right now, so they have to like, it's got to go through its whole process. But yeah,
Well, Dr. Susannah Crockford, what a delight. What a great hang. Thank you so much for stopping by the podcast and chatting with me about A Perturbed System, Religion and Climate Change from the End of a World, July 2026 from University of Chicago Press. Thank you so much for being here.
thank you so much for having me.